Welcome to the Yeshua community. In this new series, we begin a historical and chronological examination of the letters attributed to Paul. Which letters did he actually write? And how do his teachings relate to Yeshua and to Tanakh? This is Paul Under the Microscope.
In this new series, we are going to do something that many people have long wanted to do, but rarely have the space to do carefully. We are going to read the letters of Paul, critically, historically, and in light of Yeshua and the Hebrew Scriptures. This is not a series for those seeking simple answers. It is for those who have read the Bible attentively, for those who have sensed tensions in the text, for those who have wondered whether the New Testament truly presents one unified theological voice or several voices across time. In a previous episode, we questioned the doctrine of atonement. Is the idea that God requires a sacrificial death in order to forgive truly necessary? But atonement is only one piece of a much larger picture. Before we analyze theology, we must ask something more basic. Who was Paul, and which letters did he actually write? When most readers open the New Testament, they encounter Paul's letters as a single block of text. They appear as one continuous authoritative voice. But this impression is misleading. The letters are not arranged chronologically. They are ordered largely by length and traditional importance. That arrangement gives the impression that Paul's theology was fully formed from the beginning. Historically, that is unlikely. Modern biblical scholarship, across denominational lines, broadly agrees that 7 of the letters attributed to Paul are almost certainly authentic. These are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. These letters bring us closest to the historical Paul. Other letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians, are often considered disputed. They may have been written by followers in Paul's tradition. The so-called pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are widely regarded as later compositions, written after Paul's death. In the ancient world, writing in a teacher's name was not necessarily intended as deception. It could be a way of continuing a tradition. Still, this means we are dealing not with a single frozen voice, but with a developing tradition, and that matters. Another element often noted in scholarship is the language of the letters. The 7 letters considered authentic have an intense and sometimes uneven style. Sentences can be long and complex. Arguments move quickly. Thoughts are interrupted and resumed. Paul does not write like a polished Greek philosopher. He writes more like an engaged teacher who thinks aloud and argues passionately. In some of the later letters, however, we encounter smoother Greek, a different vocabulary, and a calmer, more institutional tone. This alone proves nothing. Paul may have used secretaries, as was common in antiquity. In Romans, a man named Tertius identifies himself as the one who physically wrote the letter. But when linguistic differences are combined with theological and historical differences, they give us yet another reason to read these letters with historical awareness. We cannot automatically assume that every letter reflects the same moment, the same stage of thought, or necessarily the same author. Let us now place Paul in time. The earliest letter we possess is 1st Thessalonians, likely written around the year 50 to 52. At that point, roughly 20 years had passed since Yeshua's crucifixion. Paul is not a late theological invention. He is an early voice, remarkably early. But what about his own story before this? Our most important source here is Galatians. In chapters 1 and 2, Paul provides a chronological account of his past. He begins by describing how he persecuted the early movement. He tried to destroy it. He was zealous for the traditions of his ancestors. Then he writes God revealed his Son to him. This is the turning point. Notice something important. Paul does not describe a dramatic scene of blinding light and heavenly voice. He speaks of a revelation. The well-known story of the road to Damascus appears in the book of Acts, written decades later. But our earliest source, Paul himself, describes the event in theological terms, not dramatic detail. He emphasizes that he did not immediately go up to Jerusalem to consult the apostles. Instead, he went to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Only 3 years later did he go to Jerusalem. There he met Cephas, Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. He stayed with Cephas for 15 days. After that, he worked in the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Then, 14 years later, he went up again to Jerusalem. This second visit is often associated with the Jerusalem meeting, usually dated around 48 or 49. If that identification is correct, we can work backward. If the Jerusalem meeting took place around 48 or 49, and that was 14 years after his earlier visit, and that earlier visit was 3 years after the revelation, then Paul's transformative experience likely occurred around the year 34 or 35, only a few years after Yeshua's death. When he writes 1 Thessalonians around 50 to 52, he has already been active for roughly 15 years. We can therefore sketch a preliminary timeline. Paul's revelation, approximately 34 to 35. First visit to Jerusalem, around 37 to 38. Jerusalem meeting, around 48 to 49. 1 Thessalonians, around 50 to 52. This timeline gives us historical grounding. But this series is not only about differences between letters, it is also about perspective. Paul will not only be compared with himself, early and late, but also read in light of Yeshua as he appears in the Synoptic Gospels, and in light of Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures that formed the world of both Yeshua and Paul. In much of Christian tradition, Paul has often functioned as the primary interpreter of Yeshua. In this series, we will attempt something different. We will allow Yeshua and Tanakh to serve as the reference frame, and we will examine how Paul's thought stands in relation to that foundation. In the next episode, we turn to the earliest document we possess, 1 Thessalonians. What was the message of the early Paul just 15 to 20 years after Yeshua? What did he emphasize before theology became systematized? And how does this earliest Paul stand in relation to the Jewish teacher from Galilee? This is Paul Under the Microscope. We listen carefully, we examine historically, and we ask without fear.
You've been listening to the first episode of Paul Under the Microscope. In the next episode, we turn to the earliest letter we possess, 1 Thessalonians, and begin reading Paul chronologically. Thank you for listening to the Yeshua community.